Hi class and welcome to the urinary system. This is chapter 24. We just have 2 more chapters left to get through before the end of this module. And again, I will highlight things that you guys should focus your study on in this chapter. The urinary system, its most important functions are of the kidneys, and the kidneys help to maintain the chemical consistency of your blood by either absorbing or excreting different things from the urine. It will filter many liters of fluid from the blood, and it will send all toxins, metabolic wastes, and excess water out of the body. And the main waste products are 3 nitrogenous compounds: urea, uric acid, and creatinine. Here are the organs of the urinary system: the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. And this is how the urinary system is kind of laid out. Here we have our kidneys in the retroperitoneal kind of cavity or area. That's the location that we use to describe them, retroperitoneal, because it's in the back of the peritoneum. The kidneys are connected to the bladder with the ureters. So the ureters take urine that's formed in the kidneys and take it to be stored in the bladder, and then the urethra exits the urine out of the kidneys. Kidneys are red-brown in color. They're located retroperitoneal, kind of behind the peritoneum, so kind of in this back section of the body. They're lateral to the T12 to L3 vertebra, and the average kidney is that size. The hilum is on the convex surface, and this is where everything enters and exits the kidney, like the vessels, ureter, and nerves. There's a fibrous capsule, which is the capsule of dense connective tissue surrounding each kidney. This inhibits spread of infection. The perirenal fat capsule is external to the capsule, and the renal fascia is external to the fat capsule, and that contains perirenal fat. So your kidneys are very situated nicely in that retroperitoneal. So here we have the peritoneal cavity with organs removed, and with the peritoneum layer, and you can see how the kidneys lie behind that. So retroperitoneal, they're behind that peritoneum cavity. And then you can see the supportive tissue layers surrounding the kidneys as well. All right, so the internal gross anatomy of the kidney, the renal cortex is the most superficial region. The renal medulla consists of cone-shaped renal pyramids, and the renal pelvis consists of your major and minor calyxes. The vasculature, all the arteries going into the kidney, you should know how they branch. So renal arteries will branch into segmental arteries. Segmental arteries branch into interlobar arteries, and interlobar arteries will branch into arcuate arteries, as shown here. So here we have kind of the internal anatomy of the kidney. We have the renal cortex is the lighter superficial layer, and then the renal medulla is the inner layer that has these kind of cone-shaped pyramids called renal pyramids in it. Each pyramid, it kind of empties out into a minor calyx. So you can see these minor calyxes kind of at the tips of each renal pyramid. So we have this funneling system collecting urine that's formed in the minor calyxes. They will funnel urine down in the renal pyramids will funnel urine down into the minor calyxes. The minor calyxes, when 2 or more come together, they form a major calyx. And then the renal pelvis collects all the urine that's formed from the major calyxes, and the renal pelvis will empty that urine into the ureters, which take the urine to the bladder. Here are the blood vessels of the kidney, and you should know how they branch. So we have the renal artery coming in to segmental arteries. Segmental arteries will branch into interlobar arteries, and then interlobar arteries, which are the arteries between the renal pyramids. But then the interlobar arteries will branch into arcuate arteries, and arcuate arteries will be the ones kind of on the arc. So the boundary between the renal pyramid in the medulla and the cortex. So you should know kind of that basic branching, and this kind of graph explains the branching starting off of the aorta, renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar, arcuate, cortical radiate. And then we get into the afferent glomerular arterial, which brings blood into the glomerulus, which is where the filtering will occur. It comes out of the efferent glomerular artery, changing into the peritubular capillaries and vasa recta, and then going back out through the veins. So you should know the general structure of blood arteries going into and out of the kidneys. The nerve supply is due to the renal plexus, which is kind of a group of nerves. I won't ask you guys about the nerve supply to the kidney. More microscopic anatomy of the kidney, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and you have more than 1 million nephrons in each kidney. Urine production then is with three processes: filtration, resorption, and secretion, where filtration is the filtering of the blood as it leaves the kidney capillaries. Resorption is where most nutrients, water, and essential ions are reclaimed back in to your blood system. And secretion is the active process of removing undesirable molecules into the filtrate or the urine that will leave the body. So here we have kind of an idea of glomerular filtration occurs in the glomerular capillaries, and then tubular resorption and secretion occurs throughout the peritubular capillaries. The nephron then is composed of the renal tubule and the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is the first part of the nephron. It's made of the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. The glomerulus is the tuft of capillaries, and the capillaries are fenestrated to allow substances to pass through. And then the glomerular or Bowman's capsule has a parietal and visceral layer. The parietal layer is simple squamous epithelium, and the visceral layer that actually surrounds the capillaries consists of podocytes, and we'll look at what those are. The filtration membrane filters, kind of is the filter that lies between the blood and the glomerulus and the capsular space. And it consists of these three layers: the fenestrated endothelium of the capillary itself, the filtration slits between food processes of these podocyte cells, and then the basement membrane. And the basement membrane and the slit diaphragm will hold back most proteins. So most proteins will not get into the filtrate and the urine, but it does allow the passage of these substances to get into the filtrate: water, ions, glucose, amino acids, and urea. So here we have the afferent glomerular arteriole bringing blood into the glomerulus. So you can tell that it's a little bit wider, so that allows a lot of blood pressure to help with the filtration pressure of ions being filtered through the glomerulus. And here we have the glomerular capillary covered by a podocyte containing visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. So you see these podocyte cells with the nucleus making these kind of filtration slits with their feet to allow substances to pass through. So if the filtrate will come out of the glomerular capillaries and be captured in the capillary space, and then the filtrate will then travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, and the blood that's been filtered will leave the glomerulus out of the efferent glomerular arteriole. So here's a more zoomed in look at these podocytes, and with their perivascular, with their foot processes creating these slits, these filtration slits that provide spaces for substances to pass through. Here's a look at the filtration membrane, kind of a look at a side of it. So here's the capillary. We have capillary endothelium with kind of filtration slits. Then we have spaces between the foot processes of the podocytes. So we have all of these kind of spaces to allow filtration or filtrate to pass into the capsular space. The renal tubule then, the filtrate proceeds then to the renal tubules from the glomerulus after it's been filtered from the blood. We have the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. And you have different parts of the nephron loop shown there. Then the collecting ducts will receive the urine from several nephrons. They play an important role in conserving body fluids. And the posterior pituitary will secrete antidiuretic hormone, which is ADH, and ADH will increase the permeability of your collecting ducts in the distal convoluted tubule to water. And that might be a test question. So ADH will act on your collecting ducts in the distal convoluted tubule to increase the permeability of them to water to absorb more water back into the bloodstream. So here we have the location and structure of nephrons, kind of what their epithelial layers look like. So again, blood is filtered in the glomerulus as the afferent arteriole brings blood into the nephron. So the glomerulus filters the blood, and then that filtrate travels through this tubular system. And throughout the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule, things are either reabsorbed back into the body or different things are secreted back in. to the filtrate, eventually to create urine that's formed into the collecting duct. And you can see how the collecting duct has different kind of jutting outs that will collect urine from different nephrons. The collecting duct then will empty that neuron into the minor calyx of each medullary pyramid. And again, ADH acts on the collecting duct and a little bit on the distal convoluted tubule to increase the permeability of water. So here we have histology of the nephron, more look there. The classes of nephrons, most of our nephrons are cortical nephrons, about 85%, and they refer to where they're located in the kidney itself, and about 15% are juxtamedullary nephrons. And again, this might be a test question. Most are cortical, about 85% of them. So here are cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons and their blood vessels. You can see how cortical nephrons, again, are located more in the cortex, and the juxtamedullary nephrons have a longer nephron loop. The glomerulus will be closer to the cortex medulla junction. The nephrons associate closely with two capillary beds, the glomerulus, where the filtering occurs, and then the peritubular capillaries, which will surround in the cortical nephrons, or the vasa recta in the juxtamedullary nephrons. So the glomeruli produce filtrate that becomes neuron. It's fed and drained by the afferent and efferent glomerular arteriole. The efferent arteriole has a much smaller diameter than the afferent arteriole, which is what we talked about, and it generates about 1 liter of fluid every 8 minutes, and about 99% of the filtrate that goes through the glomerulus is actually reabsorbed by the tubules later on in the process. The peritubular capillaries will arise from the efferent arterioles. They're adapted for low pressure porous capillaries. All molecules secreted by the nephrons into the urine are from peritubular capillaries. And then the vasa recta continues from the efferent arterioles of the juxtamedullary nephrons. They're thin-walled looping vessels. They descend into the medulla around the loop of Henle, and they're part of the kidney's urine concentrating mechanism. The juxtaglomerular complex functions in regulating blood pressure. It's an area of contact between the terminal end of the ascending limb and the afferent arteriole, and we have these granular cells, which are modified smooth muscle cells with secretory granules, and they will contain and secrete the hormone renin, which is secreted in response to falling blood pressure in the afferent arteriole, and renin again is secreted by granular cells. Macula densa is adjacent to the granular cells, and it helps to monitor sodium concentration of the filtrate, and it will signal the granular cells to secrete renin, and it will initiate the renin-angiotensin system to help with any decrease in blood pressure. You guys will learn about that in physiology too. More cells that I won't ask you about as a part of that juxtaglomerular complex. And you can see it here, the macula densa cells, kind of which will signal the granular cells to secrete renin in response to low blood pressure. The ureters then carry urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. There's an oblique entry into the bladder to prevent the backflow of urine. The histology of the ureter, we have a lot of transitional epithelium, some muscularis layers and adventitia, and you can see those layers of the ureter shown there. The urinary bladder is collapsible. It stores and expels urine. A full bladder gives it a spherical shape where it expands into the abdominal cavity, and an empty bladder will lie entirely within the pelvis. The urachus is the closed remnant of the allantois. You don't have to know that. The prostate in males lies directly inferior to the bladder, and it surrounds the urethra. So here we have the different position of the urinary bladder in reference to other pelvic organs. So you can see the prostate gland lying directly underneath the bladder in males, and then in females, the bladder sits right kind of underneath the uterus. So in pregnant women with an expanding uterus, because of the embryo, that baby pushes down on the bladder, and that's why pregnant women usually have to go to the bathroom a lot. The urinary bladder is composed of 3 layers: the mucosa, the thick muscular layer, which is made of the detrosor muscle, a smooth muscle, an involuntary muscle, and then the adventitia. You can see here the histology of the bladder. You might recognize this picture of the transitional epithelium. I use that picture a lot for when we're in chapter 4 talking about epithelial. Here's the structure of the urinary bladder and the urethra of the male. So the urethra is a little bit longer in the male, and it travels through the prostate gland, and of the female. So we have transitional epithelium, stratified and pseudostratified columnar in males, and then stratified squamous epithelium near the urethral opening. We have an internal urethral sphincter, which is involuntary, so that will open involuntarily without you knowing it. But the external urethral sphincter is what we control voluntarily, and that will inhibit urination, and it will relax when one urinates. The urethra in females and males is a different size and length. In males, we have 3 named regions to the urethra: the prostatic, the intermediate, and spongy, depending on what part of the body it passes through. We have the Micturition reflex, which is an involuntary reflex emptying of the bladder, which relaxes that first sphincter. But then again, the external urethral sphincter is what you control to actually expel the urine from the bladder. Micturition is the act of emptying the bladder, also called voiding or urination. It's controlled by the brain and involves autonomic and somatic pathways. Some disorders of the urinary system, urinary tract infections, are more common in females, and that's just because the urethra is shorter in females, so it's just easier for infections to get into the bladder. There's a burning sensation with micturition or urinating, not pleasant. Renal calculi or kidney stones, bladder cancer, about 3% of cancers, it's a little more common in men, and kidney cancer can arise from epithelial cells of the uriniferous tubules. I won't ask you questions about embryological development about the urinary system. If you notice, I usually skip over these because embryology can almost be its own separate class to anatomy. So I usually skip over that a little bit. The urinary system throughout life, the kidney and bladder function declines with advancing age. Nephrons decrease in size and number. Tubules will be less efficient at secretion and resorption. Filtration declines. Recognition of the desire to urinate is delayed, and the loss of muscle tone in the bladder is delayed. So sometimes the elderly have problems with how they go to the bathroom. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you for the final chapter, which will be the reproductive system.